Well, we need to start looking at art pretty quickly. There is a lot to examine. But let me still kick off today's lecture with a quick overview of some of the elements that together produced the Italian Renaissance. In my last lecture, I talked about the commercial revolution. Let me just add a few more details. In the 14th century, the development of the padded horse collar increased the weight in goods that horses could pull fivefold, the kind of historical change you don't necessarily think about, but is in fact revolutionary. At the same time, new sailing ships, such as the Portuguese caravel, made longer sea and ultimately ocean voyages feasible. These improvements in land and sea transport helped overseas trade double every generation starting in the late or mid to late 1300s. The new wealth this created went largely to the new upstart capitalists like Cosimo Medici, who, themselves adventurers and risk-takers, were more willing to invest in other talented newcomers. It's hard to find bright spots in a plague that killed almost half of Europe's population, but the Black Death also accelerated change. The old social order was badly shaken, and individuals were as a result more open to change and to new ideas. The huge death toll ironically enriched many survivors, some of whom inherited enough capital to become investors. Several great Florentine fortunes were actually established this way. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Byzantine Greek scholars fled to Italy, and they brought with them previously unknown Greek texts. This, combined with Italy's lingering remnants of ancient Rome, the ancient world was much more real to people in Italy. It helped inspire a classical revival. Some more developments. As new texts arrived in Western Europe, the newly invented printing press put them into the hands of the rising middle class, or merchant class at least. Literacy expanded beyond the clergy, which helped to create a secular audience and market for literature and art. By 1500, less than a century after the first printed book, Venice alone had 150 printing presses. While religious texts continue to dominate publishing, the presses also turned out works on classical mythology, on history, on biography, which focused still more admiration on the heroic individual and further strengthened humanism. Cheap paper, another one of those things you don't think about. Before, you'd had to use vellum or parchment, but cheap paper made from wood pulp made printed works affordable, and it also allowed artists to sketch much more freely, which gave them an opportunity to experiment with new techniques. You saw Michelangelo's grocery list. Think of the incredible sketchbooks of Leonardo da Vinci. We'll see some of that next week. Patronage became cool. Let me quote from one of my favorite historians, Paul Johnson, who has a very good short history of the Renaissance, if anyone wants to read more. He says, "The Renaissance was one of the few times in human history when success in the world's game, the struggle for military supremacy and political domination, was judged, at least in part, on cultural patronage." I just add that it didn't hurt that bankers and condottieri or mercenary soldier princes hoped to win forgiveness by erecting and decorating churches. Finally, patrons looking for talent could draw on a long tradition of meticulous craftsmanship. Ghiberti, for example, was only 23 years old, but he was a goldsmith, a trained goldsmith, when he won the competition to sculpt and cast the doors of the Florence Cathedral Baptistry. The craft workshop he set up to execute this commission that took 20 years trained, among others, Donatello, whom we're going to see much more of today, and Uccello, whom we'll meet tomorrow. Or I should say Thursday in this case. So let's move on to the famous competition panels. Their submission in 1401 is often cited as the opening event of the Renaissance. Now, historians still debate about why Ghiberti beat out Brunelleschi, and Brunelleschi has his proponents, people who think he should have won. One persuasive argument is that Ghiberti's design, because it used less bronze, would cost the city fathers fewer florins. They were, after all, bankers and merchants. They knew how to count. A more generous interpretation would be that Ghiberti's ability to cast his bronze in just two pieces while producing more detail showed that he was the greater master of the craft elements of production. And you have to remember that artists were still viewed at least as much, if not more, as craftsmen than as innovative creators, especially this early in the Renaissance. Remember, we're still in the early 1400s. Note, too, that both works are highly expressive and filled with movement, and that the figures in each stand realistically employing contrapposto. So it's not like Brunelleschi is a Romanesque sculptor. He is clearly a Renaissance figure, and in fact is going to be very important in this unit in other regards. But it still seems pretty clear that while Brunelleschi's work is arguably the more emotionally powerful, Ghiberti's shows a much greater grasp of the spatial techniques that had largely disappeared with the fall of Rome and that to many in Florence represented the rebirth of classical humanism. One of these techniques, illustrated in the circled sections of Ghiberti's in the upper circled section, is foreshortening. Another is the depiction of the human body. That's why I've circled Isaac. We'll get there. But first, let me make one other point. You remember the name for the design pattern that's used to outline the story in both panels, because it was, in fact, a requirement of the competition. It's a quatrefoil, and it's very much a Gothic figure. You've seen these on Gothic cathedrals, and we'll see that it disappears pretty soon. But the shape actually had symbolic and theological significance. The rounded edges represented the eternal divine, while the sharp triangular edges represented the mortality and limitations of humanity. Just thought that was an interesting point. Remember back at the beginning of the course when we talked about the difference between optical and conceptual art? Now it's important. Optical art tries to capture images as our eye actually perceives them. Foreshortening is a technique that depicts in varying degrees the distortion that our eye sees when we view an object or a figure at a distance or at an unusual angle. So looking more closely now at the way Ghiberti sculpted the angel in the upper right corner, I've tried to zoom in for this. This is really the first time since antiquity that we see a figure punching out of the pictorial space into what art historians or art theorists call negative space. The mountain, likewise, sorry, it doesn't show here, likewise gives more spatial dimension to the composition while introducing a strong element of naturalism. But above all, and again, you probably want to look back to the previous slide here, notice the way Ghiberti captures the contrapposto stance. In fact, I can do that. Yes. Notice how he captures the contrapposto stance, defined musculature, and nudity of classical sculpture. And now, we'll try to move forward again. Oops, I'm sorry, that's the problem with fiddling with that. We see the Hellenistic sculpture of the Gallic chieftain killing himself. Notice the similarities between that and the figure of Isaac we just saw. I'm sorry, I should have put those side by side on my slides. Now, this is a busy slide, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but you might take a look at it, because I actually think it's a very helpful illustration of foreshortening and how it works. Okay, now we get a closer look at the figures of Isaac. So back to the competition between Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Notice the similarities and differences in the ways the artist chose to depict Isaac. And again, I've tried to zoom in. So what do you see? It's interesting that Ghiberti's Isaac is actually less emotional. He's almost serene. And maybe that's because he's caught sight of the angel. Maybe it's because he represents a classical historic ideal, impassive in the face of death. But note again how much more detailed and realistic his body is. So we see many of the same techniques employed by Ghiberti's famous student, who surpassed Ghiberti. This was a scene that was sculpted for the baptismal font of Siena Cathedral, the Feast of Herod, and basically you have John the Baptist's head being brought to him on a platter. And what early Renaissance elements do you observe in this? Well, notice the horror we see on the faces of the banqueters suddenly confronted with John the Baptist's head, and the children cowering in the corner. So that's this naturalistic, emotional emphasis. And as our eyes move back into the composition, notice that the figures become calmer and more detached. They're not yet witnessing this horrific scene, so that contrast is very dramatic. The figures have real bodies under their clothes with muscles, flesh, and bone. And note how all the figures, even the children, twist around the head of John the Baptist. The tension radiates out, up and right, really from the corner. This is not a perfectly symmetrical composition. Even though you have figures on both sides, the energy really goes up from the left corner. The architectural features, and that creates a sense of dynamism. You have kind of off-center focal point, because the focal point is clearly the head of John the Baptist. The architectural features help draw the eye back into the space, and so does the open center and the pattern in the floor. Already, this work shows a greater mastery of one-point perspective than that Filippo Brunelleschi had discovered and systematized. Oops, I left out something that I should have mentioned in that. I thought it was on the slide, and it may show up later. You also see atmospheric perspective in that you see lower relief figures toward the back. So it's high relief in the front, lower relief toward the back, just as objects become more blurred and faded to our eye as they extend. I think I'm going to be making that point later. But at any rate, on to perspective. Sorry about this. A lot of material to cover here. Because this brings me to one of the most important technical aspects of the course, the development of the mathematically based optical technique of perspective. Now, the Greeks understood and employed perspective, and Pythagoras worked out some of the math. But it was Filippo Brunelleschi and his Italian Renaissance successors who would rediscover and then build on these insights. I chose this photo because it demonstrates the simplest optical perception of depth. As we look down the sidewalk into the distance, the space narrows, and eventually it would disappear altogether, and that's what's called the vanishing point. Here's another diagram that makes the point schematically. The horizon lies on a line with the vanishing point. The ground line represents the place we stand. And those diagonals, which are called orthogonals, provide a mathematical means of drawing to optical or perspective scale. Okay, I really didn't assign every Khan Academy video from this unit as homework. I saved this one for class. By the way, you'll need to know Alberti, who shows up in the video. Okay, at least at this point, we're not going to worry as much about 2- and 3-point perspective. We may hit upon it when we get to later Venetian art and to Baroque painting. And the College Board won't generally get all that technical on you. But these drawings should give you an idea of how the same mathematical ideas can be applied to 2 or even 3 vanishing points. Okay, Ghiberti worked on the first set of baptistry doors for more than 20 years. In 1425, the church officials gave him another commission for baptistry doors. And by the way, they didn't have a competition this time. They trusted Ghiberti at this point. So his first set of doors was moved to the north wall, and a new set of doors was hung in its place on the east wall. It's Michelangelo who would dub these the Gates of Paradise. So before we look at one of the panels more closely, what obvious differences do you see? Well, the Gates of Paradise are gilded. The quatrefoil design was abandoned. Ghiberti chose to sculpt fewer, larger panels, much more detailed. The north doors contained scenes from the Old and New Testament. The Gates of Paradise depicted 10 scenes from the book of Genesis. Essentially, this is a much more mature work, and it also reflects the extraordinary artistic development that's taken place in just 2 decades of the Italian Renaissance. So now you can compare 2 panels by Ghiberti, the competition panel you saw earlier, the sacrifice of Isaac, and a scene of Isaac with his sons Jacob and Esau. So what other differences do you see? This is where I was talking about atmospheric perspective. I was worried there. The new doors make much more use of architectural space and the new science of perspective. The lines are included, there they are, to show the orthogonals and the vanishing point. By sculpting the figures at the back and lower relief, Ghiberti also employed atmospheric or aerial perspective. When our eye sees a landscape, and we talked about this early in the course, but you may not remember it. When our eye sees a landscape, for example, the figures further back are lighter, bluer, less defined. Think of how you look out over the mountains, and the mountains further in the distance are are fuzzier, bluer, lighter. That's atmospheric perspective. Ghiberti, rather amazingly, pulls it off with sculpture by using the lighter relief, the lower relief in the back. These figures are not nude, but again, we see the dynamism of the bodies under the clothes. Ghiberti also employed the technique of continuous narrative. I've circled 3 scenes from left to right as you look at the slide. On the left, far left, you see midwives attending the birth of Jacob and Esau. Then in the middle, you see Isaac sending Esau out to hunt meat for his dinner. Remember, that's when Jacob tricks him. And finally, Isaac giving his reluctant blessing to Jacob as Rebekah looks on. Okay, sorry, pausing for a water break. Let me touch briefly on another important set of competitive sculptures at the Orsa Michele in Florence. Past AP tests have included questions about these statues, so this is not a digression. Orsa Michele was the chapel of Florence's powerful crafts guilds. By the way, Ms. Jacobs, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, correct me, okay? The competitive spirit that animated Florentine commerce, well, it infected the guilds as well, and they vied with each other to hire the most talented craftsmen to portray their guild's patron saints. And by the way, they would have seen artists as fellow craftsmen, and in fact, as we'll see in a minute, there was a sculptors' guild. In fact, this statue by Nanni de Banco represented the Guild of Sculptors. The subject is 4 martyred patron saints. These were sculptors who defied the Emperor Diocletian's orders to sculpt a pagan deity and were martyred. Note that these figures occupy 3-dimensional space in a way that even those dramatic Rams sculptures do not. That's the Visitation, as you may recall. The outer saints bear a strong resemblance to Roman imperial statues, which is why I've included the Marcus Aurelius statue for comparison. The inner statues show somewhat more emotion, but all of the figures have very individualized features. This is a development we began to see with the Gothic jam sculptures. Remember, that's referred to as Gothic humanism. Humanism is not solely an invention of the Renaissance. It's important to understand that. But we still see further development in the direction of more individuality here. The most famous of the Orsa Michele sculptures is Donatello's St. Mark, the patron saint of linen drapers. Note the linen pillow that the saint is standing on. So what classical figures do you see, and what marks this out as a more distinctly Renaissance sculpture? Well, you recognize the contrapposto stance, right? And there's the comparison to the Doryphorus. But St. Mark's expressive face harkens more to the emotionalism of Hellenistic sculpture or to the Renaissance celebration of individual humanity. Now, before we look at later and more controversial works by Donatello, let's return to the story of Cosimo de' Medici. I'm skipping over a segment in which his enemies succeed in banishing Cosimo from the city. Feel free to watch it on your own. I thought it was fun. But to fast forward, the economic catastrophe that follows in the wake of his exile basically leads Florence to invite him back as the virtual, although unofficial, ruler of the city. Cosimo always insists on not taking an official title, maintaining a relatively modest existence. It's at this point that Cosimo de' Medici's art patronage really takes off. And by the way, I think this video presents a very interesting and plausible thesis about how Cosimo de' Medici's tolerance and indeed encouragement of individual creative vision helped create what we call the Italian Renaissance. Okay, this is one of the most famous works in art history and one you have to be able to recognize. The video captures what struck me right between the eyes, really, when I saw this for the first time, if you will, in the flesh. It is a deeply, almost creepily sensual statue. And I say creepily, and by the way, it's really full size. I say creepily because of the overtones of pedophilia and because of the way the figure's nudity is accentuated by the fact that he's still wearing boots and a hat and the way that feather sneaks up his thigh. It's a little unnerving. And then there's that stance that's both relaxed and defiant, but he's clearly sticking his butt out. But note the off-kilter symmetria. That's really reminiscent of Hellenistic art. Think of the Laocoon. Donatello sets up a dynamic contrast between bent and straight, between relaxed and tense. Florentine sculptures actually produced 3 famous Davids and probably a lot of less famous Davids. We'll get to Michelangelo's David next week, and I'm sure you all know that one. This bronze by Verrocchio was sculpted a few decades later than Donatello's David. So what differences do you notice? And by the way, these differences are due more to the artist's different vision than to the slightly later date of the Verrocchio piece. Well, this David is also an adolescent, but he's kind of a cocky bad boy. I don't think this is nearly a sexualized depiction. Your textbook suggests that the model might have been one of Verrocchio's streetwise apprentices, and I can really see that. Nevertheless, the postures are quite similar. Oh, sorry, the mailman probably just came. With the off-kilter contrapposto stance. So why are there so many statues of David in Florence? Remember that Florence was a small, beleaguered republic, beset by kingdoms such as Naples and later France. So the boy who defeated the giant and his mighty empire resonated with the Florentines. Maggie and Tori, be quiet. Remember this statue from the first Remember this statue from the first unit? The Florentines liked Judith as well, for the same reasons. This famous statue does not appear in your book. Girls! No! Sorry. But I wanted to include it, in part just because I really like it, but also because it too shocked the people of Florence. Donatello sculpted this figure in wood about a quarter of a century after his David, and you have a real sense of how his artistic vision has matured. This was not the Mary Magdalene that Italians were used to seeing in churches, the beautiful young prostitute who turned to Jesus. This is Mary Magdalene wandering in the desert, suffering the loss of Christ. The comparison with the Roetgen Pietà is striking. Both are wood sculptures, both display deep, almost wild emotion. I could really see the College Board juxtaposing these two in an image-based question. I didn't actually see one of those, but I could imagine it. Oops, and there it is. Sorry, I hadn't realized I hadn't pulled it up. Here we see the first full-fledged equestrian portrait since the statue of Marcus Aurelius on the right. Gattamelata, which is a nickname Honey Cat, and was the unlikely nickname of a condottiere who had saved Venice. So what differences do you see between Donatello's sculpture and the Roman Empire era statue of Marcus Aurelius? Well, the soldier, Donatello gets the soldier in proper proportion to the horse. But even more significant is the way the personalities are depicted. Marcus Aurelius saw himself, and he's also portrayed as a philosopher emperor who was a rather reluctant, if dutiful, military leader. Gattamelata is also a civic leader with responsibility, but he's unapologetically a soldier. Notice how the baton of leadership segues into the sword of command. This is not an apology for military power. It recognizes it as a political reality. And in fact, for the Italian city-states struggling to maintain their independence, strong military was a very vital element of the civic culture. So here's another Donatello-Verrocchio comparison. Neither artist knew his subject, by the way. Both men were already dead when the commissions were executed. So this is really the vision that each artist has of a great military and political leader. What differences do you see? How do the two artists see military power, and how do they see them differently? Well, to my eye, Verrocchio's condottiere is fiercer, tenser, more dynamic, maybe meaner, more the warrior than the statesman-soldier Gattamelata. Well, we have covered a lot of material, and there is no slowing down. In the next lecture, we will turn to early Renaissance painting, which in some ways was even more revolutionary than Renaissance sculpture, although sculpture tended to lead the way. Stay tuned.